Bienvenidos sean todos al micrófono, un video podcast original de la Universidad del Norte en el que expertos comparten sobre tendencias y mucha actualidad. Pónganse cómodos, que yo soy Andrés Artús Fernández y ya vamos a iniciar con un episodio muy especial del micrófono y tiene que ver con un contenido que les vamos a entregar de parte de la maestría en la enseñanza del inglés y consiste en una entrevista que va a realizar Rodrigo Rodríguez. Él es profesor asistente del Departamento de Lenguas Extranjeras de la Universidad del Norte y va a estar con Ginther, quien es profesora emérita de la Purdue University de Estados Unidos y es profesora honoraria de la Universidad del Norte. Ellos van a compartir una conversación con ustedes en las que van a poder entender mejor el aprendizaje o técnicas para el aprendizaje y evaluar el aprendizaje de los estudiantes del inglés. A Rodrigo y a April, bienvenidos al micrófono.
Gracias, Andrés. So, Dr. Ginther, language instructors all the time hear the words rating scales, rubrics, and checklists. Could you illustrate us about what's the difference between rating scales, rubrics, and checklists?
Sure. And first, thanks for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk about things that I think are super interesting, and I hope to the audience as well. But for the most part, when we talk about scales, we're familiar with many of their uses. For example, we might stand on a scale to see how much we weigh, or measure our height against the bathroom door, which is a common thing in the United States, where we mark people's progress every year, our kids, our cousins. And so those kinds of scales are obvious to us and familiar. However, when we switch to the measurement of psychological constructs, they become a little bit more difficult to understand. When we talk about a language rating scale, we're talking about a set of numbers that are linked to characteristics of performance on the other side. How do we link them? Well, we link the performance to the numbers on the scale through a set of procedures, through descriptions, by using benchmarks, and then we can classify people, it's just a way to sort people, into groups. For example, in language, we're usually interested in finding out whether the learner is a beginner, an intermediate learner, or an advanced learner. These are important because we want to push our students through or help our students get through classes that start at the beginning and have some endpoint. So having an articulated scale helps us do that, helps us track progress over time in the development of anything, any phenomenon. So when we talk about scales, we're talking about characteristics of performance linked to numbers through a set of procedures or rules. Okay. But we can adapt scales to the classroom use, and then they usually are called rubrics. They have all the characteristics of scales, but they have a different function, a different purpose. Perhaps just to walk someone through as a particular task in the classroom rather than placing them in a position on a scale, which is sort of the broader interest that we have over time. So what's the difference between a scale and a rubric and a checklist? The difference is what the purpose is and how we're using it.
Okay. So now that we have cleared the difference among these three, let's focus a little bit on rubrics. So why are rubrics so important for language instructors today?
Well, let me go back to scales, and then we'll go to rubrics again.
Okay.
When we rate people on a scale, and when we do it as a community of practice, the important thing about having that scale is that everyone can agree on the characteristics of performance that we value most, that we think are most important in terms of demonstrating to the world or to the student himself or herself that they're making progress. When we use those scales consistently inside of a program, or when they're imposed upon us, like, for example, with the TOEFL, or with the IELTS, or with the CEFR, it allows larger groups of community to examine the performance of that person. So it's important for us to use rubrics in the classroom because they explain to the student what are the characteristics of expected performance to leave or to complete the task at a particular level. And why is it important to use rubrics across classes? Because we don't want the performance to be rated differently by teachers, the same performance. We want the teachers to sort of be in the same place in terms of the success of the performance. So we don't want you're getting an A in the class or a B or C or failing the class to be dependent on the teacher that you get, but rather on the characteristics of your performance as associated with some rubric. So, for example, we always hear about teachers who might fail a student because they, when they write, make some grammatical errors or some comma errors. And the teacher maybe has a good justification for doing this, but it's not something that most teachers uniformly will embrace. We think the characteristics of the rubrics or the scales, like the omission of an article or a bound morphology error or a comma splice, that's part of the performance when we're writing, but it's not all of it. So when we agree on a rubric, we agree with the community about the things that we think are most important and least important. Now let's say the teacher that wants to fail the student because they made a comma error may want to justify that position with all the other teachers. But when we create rubrics, we're creating a categorization that we agree upon as a community. So probably that teacher that's just focused on comma errors might have to adjust their practice a little bit.
Okay. So, yeah, it's a shared
Vision.
criteria and indicators. Okay,
Right.
shared vision. So, what is the difference between analytic and holistic scales, and when is better to use one instead of the other?
Right. So when we think about performance, especially writing and speaking, we really can't measure those aspects of language proficiency easily with, for example, a multiple choice test or certain discrete kind of items. It's better if we rate to a scale. And our scales could be holistic, which tries to get at the characteristics of the performance in general. So when we ask raters to rate using a holistic scale, they're indicating what their general impression is of that particular performance. We can break down the scales into subcategories. For example, when we're rating performance on an essay or a spoken performance, we might break it down into fluency, into grammatical accuracy, into vocabulary, into coherence. And all of those subcategories can also be rated on a scale. It's fine to use holistic or analytic, depending upon your purpose. If you're very interested in diagnosing the aspects of performance that need support on the part of the student or need most to be developed, maybe you want to use an analytic scale so you can look at the performance more carefully based on the sub-criteria that I mentioned. But if you want to do it more quickly and where small details aren't as important, just a general impression is what's important. Like using a scale to place a person in a particular level or class, then it's probably more useful to use a holistic scale. The thing is, in both cases, raters have to be trained to the scale. Lots of times people say, when we're rating to a scale, that what we're doing is just identifying or expressing our opinions. And it's totally subjective.
Right.
No, that's not true. When we're rating to a scale, that means that we have agreed upon particular criteria or that are most important. And we can evaluate the raters' performances by seeing the extent to which they agree. Okay? So when we rate to a scale, it's not being subjective. It's embracing a community awareness of particular aspects of performance that we as a community value most. So scales can have different descriptors and different benchmarks, so examples of a particular performance. They say, this person is a 5 on this scale, on a scale that goes from 1 to 5. This person's a 5. I think they're great. And it gives you a set of characteristics that that person is able to manifest in their performance. But one program may decide that they want to value or highlight different aspects of the scale. So it's really important that when you develop a scale, that you realize that it's a bunch of teachers or a bunch of people working together to articulate what values are most important to them.
And that's where the subjectivity ends.
Right, because we're saying we're going to agree upon this definition. In language testing, we say what's most important is considering the construct. But we have to, of course, realize that the construct is something that we invent. It's not, in a psychological scale, we're not talking about the characteristics of a physical object, like height or weight. We're talking about characteristics of performance that are manifest in social situations. So when we develop the construct, what we're doing is developing those aspects of performance that we as a community value most.
And those are context sensitive.
I think so. And there's probably even a place for the teacher who wants just to focus on punctuation errors. You could make that the most important thing in your scale if you wanted to, right?
Right.
But the important thing is that we agree upon it together and establish that scale as part of our practice in a community of practice.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ginther. Andrés, muchas gracias.
Gracias, Rodrigo. Gracias, April. Y de esta manera terminamos con este episodio de Al Micrófono y con una entrevista entre Rodrigo Rodríguez y April Ginther, quienes conversaron sobre técnicas para evaluar mejor a los estudiantes en el aprendizaje del inglés. Recuerden que Al Micrófono te invita a conocer las diferentes opciones de especializaciones, maestrías y doctorados que ofrece la Universidad del Norte con tan solo ingresar a www.uninorte.edu.co. También los invitamos a seguirnos en nuestras plataformas digitales y redes sociales y nos vemos en un nuevo episodio de Al Micrófono, un podcast original de Uninorte en el que expertos comparten sobre tendencias y actualidad. Hasta una próxima emisión.
Accede a este y otros contenidos cuando quieras. Suscríbete, aprende y comparte.